The case of Mason Sisk is one of the most tragic and unsettling stories to emerge in recent years. A 14-year-old boy's actions led to the devastating loss of an entire family, shaking the small town of Elkmont, Alabama, to its core. This case explores the events leading up to the tragedy, the legal journey that followed, and the questions it raises about juvenile justice and mental health.
Mason Sisk, a 14-year-old boy from Elkmont, Alabama, lived in a small and close-knit rural community. Known as a quiet town, Elkmont rarely saw incidents of serious crime, making what happened on September 2, 2019, even more shocking. That evening, Mason called 911, reporting that he had heard gunshots upstairs in his family home. When police arrived, they found the bodies of 5 family members: his father, John Sisk, his stepmother, Mary Sisk, and 3 young siblings. All had been fatally shot. Initially, Mason told investigators that he had been in the basement and heard the gunshots, but didn't know what happened. His calm demeanor raised suspicions, and as the investigation unfolded, evidence began to contradict his account. Police found the murder weapon, a 9mm handgun, discarded near the scene. It was soon discovered that the gun had been illegally obtained by John Sisk, Mason's father. Ballistic tests linked the gun to the killings. After hours of questioning, Mason confessed to committing the murders. He admitted to shooting his family while they were asleep, though he provided no clear motive for his actions. His lack of emotion during the confession deeply unsettled investigators. Mason's family history revealed a troubled dynamic. Reports suggested that Mary Sisk, a special education teacher, had taken on a significant caregiving role for Mason and his younger siblings. Mason reportedly struggled with discipline and exhibited behavioral issues. Neighbors and teachers described Mason as a quiet and withdrawn teenager. However, some accounts suggested he had a history of troubling behavior, including instances of cruelty to animals and conflicts at school. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the Elkmont community. Vigils were held to mourn the victims, and the community grappled with the unimaginable loss of an entire family. Questions about Mason's mental health and potential warning signs dominated local conversations. Mason's arrest marked the beginning of a complex legal battle. As a juvenile charged with such serious crimes, the court faced difficult decisions about how to proceed with his case. The question of whether Mason should be tried as an adult or a juvenile became a central issue. Mason Sisk's legal proceedings drew national attention. Prosecutors argued that the nature of the crime, the calculated killing of 5 family members, warranted trying Mason as an adult. They emphasized the premeditation involved, pointing to Mason's confession and evidence from the crime scene. The defense argued that Mason's age and possible mental health issues should be considered mitigating factors. They highlighted his turbulent upbringing and potential exposure to trauma, suggesting that his actions may have stemmed from unresolved psychological struggles. In 2021, Mason was indicted as an adult, facing charges of capital murder. The decision sparked debate about how the justice system handles cases involving juveniles accused of severe crimes. Critics questioned whether a life sentence for someone so young was justifiable. During the trial, prosecutors presented chilling details about the crime. They described how Mason methodically planned and carried out the murders, shooting each family member in their sleep. Testimony from forensic experts and law enforcement painted a grim picture of the events that unfolded that night. The defense countered with arguments about Mason's mental state, suggesting that he lacked the emotional maturity to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. They called for leniency, urging the court to prioritize rehabilitation over punishment. In 2023, Mason Sisk was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The verdict brought a sense of closure to some in the community, but left others grappling with the complexity of the case. The tragedy raised broader questions about juvenile justice, mental health intervention, and the role of community in identifying and addressing warning signs. Advocates for reform pointed to Mason's case as an example of the need for better support systems for at-risk youth. Elkmont continues to mourn the loss of the Sisk family. The case has become a somber reminder of the importance of early intervention and the need for a deeper understanding of the factors that contribute to such tragedies. Mason's story is a cautionary tale, highlighting the devastating consequences of untreated emotional and behavioral issues. It serves as a call to action for communities, educators, and policymakers to work together to prevent future tragedies.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're headed to a small town, Elkmont, Alabama. Back in 2019, this quiet town was shaken by a horrific crime. And we're going to kind of unpack this case, looking at how family dynamics and the juvenile justice system collide, and how a community tries to heal after something like this.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that makes you think about, what could lead someone, especially a young person, to commit such a terrible act.
For sure. And we're talking about 14-year-old Mason Sisk. It was late September 2nd when he called 911, and he told the operator he heard gunshots coming from upstairs. And when police arrived, they found a truly devastating scene.
Yeah, 5 members of Mason's family were found dead, all shot. His father, John Sisk, his stepmother, Mary Sisk, and his 3 younger siblings. I mean, it's hard to even imagine.
I know, right? And of course, because Mason was the one who made that 911 call, he immediately became the focus of the investigation. At first, he said he was in the basement and didn't see anything. But as investigators dug deeper, they started to find some holes in his story.
Well, and the murder weapon was found, a 9mm handgun right there at the scene. And that's where we start to see how complicated the family situation might have been. Because it turns out John Sisk, Mason's dad, had that gun illegally.
Right. And you have to wonder what kind of environment that created for Mason,
Absolutely.
As the investigation went on, more and more evidence pointed to Mason, and eventually he confessed.
And that confession was, well, it was chilling, not just because of, what he admitted to, but because he reportedly showed no emotion, like absolutely none. When he was describing how he shot his entire family while they were sleeping, it's hard to grasp,
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what was going on in his mind. Was this planned out, or was there something else going on, something deeper?
Yeah, I think to try and understand any of that, we have to look at Mason's life. his family, how he grew up.
Okay, so let's do that. What do we know about his family history?
Well, reports suggest that things weren't exactly peaceful in that house. Mary Sisk, Mason's stepmom, was a special ed teacher, and it sounds like she was really the one taking care of the kids. And there's some information out there that Mason had a history of behavioral problems, trouble with discipline and stuff.
So, we're starting to see maybe a picture of a kid who is facing some serious challenges at home. We have to be careful about speculating, but these details, they help us get a clear picture of the context of this whole thing, right?
Definitely. And I think it's also important to consider how this tragedy affected the entire community. It's not just about one family. It's about the ripple effect.
For sure. Elkmont's a small, close-knit community, so you can only imagine how this must have hit everyone. I mean, did it bring people together or did it, tear them apart?
Well, it was a bit of both, really. There were vigils, so much support for the family, and a shared sense of just grief. But there are also so many questions, anxieties, fears, people trying to make sense of how something this awful could happen in their town.
It's that human need to understand, right? Especially when something seems so senseless.
Right.
And that brings us to the legal battle, right? I mean, how do you even approach a case like this with the defendant so young facing charges this serious?
Well, this is where things get even more complicated. Because Mason was a minor, the court had a big decision to make, whether to try him as an adult or handle the case within the juvenile justice system.
Okay, so break that down for me. What are the big differences between those two systems? I mean, how do they approach a young offender versus an adult offender?
The juvenile justice system is built around the idea of rehabilitation, not punishment. It's about addressing the root of the problem, giving young people support, helping them change, so they can become productive members of society, which is a different approach than the adult system, which is more about punishment and deterrence.
That makes sense. But in this case, you're talking about 5 lives lost. Accountability has to be a factor, right? So how do they balance that need for accountability with trying to rehabilitate someone?
It's a tough question. And in certain cases, especially ones as serious as this, the court can decide to transfer a juvenile to the adult system. And that's a huge decision because being tried as an adult means potentially way harsher penalties, longer prison sentences, a criminal record that follows you, forever.
Right. So that's not something they take lightly, I'm sure. What are some of the things they consider when making a decision like that?
Well, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. It varies by state. But generally, they look at the seriousness of the crime, the kid's age, how mature they seem, whether they've been in trouble before, and also what kind of support and rehab programs are available within the juvenile system.
So in Mason's case, they did decide to try him as an adult. What was the reasoning there?
Well, the court decided that the sheer horror of what happened, combined with doubts about whether he could really be rehabilitated within the juvenile system, meant that the case should go to adult court. I mean, remember, the prosecution was arguing premeditation, and the defense's arguments about his mental state didn't convince the court.
Okay, so that leads to the verdict and the sentence. What happened?
Well, after a pretty long trial, the jury found Mason guilty of capital murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. That's the toughest sentence you can get in Alabama for a crime like this.
And I imagine that sentence brought up a lot of discussion and debate. Some people probably felt like it was the only just punishment for something so terrible, while others might have questioned whether it was right for someone who was only 14.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it goes back to what's the purpose of our justice system? Are we aiming for revenge? Are we trying to help people change? Or is it some combination?
Right.
In Mason's case, the court definitely focused on punishment. They decided his actions were so bad that the absolute harshest sentence was justified.
And it makes sense that the sentence would reflect, how serious the crime was and how it affected the victims' families and the community as a whole. But it also makes you wonder if a sentence like that, life without parole, especially for someone so young, does it allow for any possibility of change, of redemption?
And that's a big part of the debate about how we sentence young offenders. People who are against life without parole, they argue that it ignores the fact that teenagers are different from adults. Their brains are still developing, they can change, and that this kind of sentence is just plain cruel and unusual, especially for them.
It's about recognizing that someone's actions, even horrific ones, don't always tell the whole story, right? And that especially with a young person, there might be so much more going on, developmentally, emotionally.
Exactly. The defense was really pushing the idea that Mason's mental state should be considered, arguing that his age and maybe his difficult upbringing should matter. They were basically trying to show that he wasn't emotionally or mentally mature enough to truly grasp what he was doing, the consequences, the finality of it all.
It's a really complex issue, and I don't think there are any easy answers.
No, not at all. And the court had to weigh all of that before reaching a verdict. This case really highlights how tough it is for the juvenile justice system to try to balance, the need to hold someone accountable with the understanding that young people can change and turn things around.
Right, and it's a reminder that, this case isn't just about what happened, but also about Mason's ability to understand and be held responsible for his actions. It brings up some big questions about what it means to be culpable, especially when you're dealing with a young person.
Definitely. The defense was arguing that rehabilitation should be the goal, not just punishment. They emphasized that Mason had the potential to grow, that with the right help, he could become a productive member of society.
Their whole argument focused on the idea that a young person's brain is still developing, so their actions, even terrible ones, might not be driven by, the same level of planning or malice as an adult's actions might be. It's a tough one.
It really is. And the court had to consider all of these factors before reaching a verdict. This case shows how tough it is for the juvenile justice system to balance the need for accountability with the understanding that young people are different, they can change, and be rehabilitated.
Before we go into the verdict and the sentence, let's take a moment to hear from you, the listener. What are your initial reactions to this case? What questions are running through your mind as we explore this complex story?
We'll be back after a short break to delve deeper into the legal proceedings and explore the broader implications of the Elkmont tragedy.
We were just talking about the arguments from both sides, the prosecution and the defense, in Mason Sisk's trial. The prosecution focused on premeditation, while the defense was emphasizing his age and the potential for rehabilitation. This really puts the spotlight on how challenging the juvenile justice system can be, right?
It does. The juvenile justice system is, it's meant to deal with cases involving kids, minors.
Mm-hmm.
It recognizes that young people are just different from adults, developmentally, how mature they are, and how much they can change and be rehabilitated. But cases like this serious, they make us face those differences head on in a really stark way.
So let's dig into those complexities a bit more. What are the main differences between how the system handles juvenile offenders compared to adults?
Often people describe the juvenile justice system as more focused on rehabilitation than punishment. It's about trying to figure out what caused the behavior, giving support and services to help them make positive changes so they can, eventually become productive members of society. That's a different approach from the adult system, which is more about punishment, making them pay for what they did and deterring future crime.
That makes sense. But in this case, 5 people were killed. Accountability has to be a major factor, right? How does the system balance that need to hold someone accountable with these goals of rehabilitation?
That's the big challenge, right? In some cases, especially the really serious ones, the court might decide to move the case to the adult system for trial. That's a big decision with big implications. Being tried as an adult could mean much harsher punishments, like much longer prison sentences and a criminal record that stays with them, for life.
It sounds like a decision that needs to be made very carefully. So what are the specific things courts look at when deciding whether to try a juvenile as an adult?
Well, it's not like a set formula, It can vary depending on the state. But usually they consider the seriousness of what happened, the kid's age, their maturity level, if they have a criminal record already, and what kind of rehab programs are available for them within the juvenile justice system.
Got it. So in Mason's case, they did decide to try him as an adult. What was the thinking behind that?
The court determined that given just how awful this crime was, and because they had concerns about whether Mason could really be rehabilitated in the juvenile system, the case needed to be moved to adult court. And remember, the prosecution was pushing the premeditation angle pretty hard, and the defense's arguments about Mason's mental state just weren't persuasive enough for the court.
Okay, so that brings us to the verdict and sentencing, which are obviously incredibly weighty in this case. What was the outcome of the trial?
After a long trial, the jury found Mason guilty of capital murder. He received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. And that's the harshest sentence you can get in Alabama for this type of crime.
I can imagine that sentence sparked a lot of debate. Some people probably believe that it's the only just punishment for such a horrific crime, while others might have questioned whether it's appropriate for someone who was only 14 at the time. It takes us back to those questions about what the purpose of the justice system really is, right? Are we seeking retribution, rehabilitation, or a blend of both?
It's a question that has been debated for ages, and honestly, there are no simple answers. In Mason's situation, the court definitely emphasized accountability and punishment. The sentence shows they believe that his actions were so serious that they deserved the most severe penalty available under the law.
It's a decision that shows the gravity of the crime and the effect it had on the victims' families and the whole community. But it also makes you think about whether a sentence of life without parole, especially for someone so young, allows for any chance of redemption, any personal growth.
That's a key point in the ongoing discussions about sentencing juveniles. People who disagree with life without parole sentences argue that they don't consider the developmental differences between teenagers and adults. They say these sentences ignore the potential for rehabilitation and are basically cruel and unusual punishment, particularly for young offenders.
It's a discussion that touches on some fundamental questions about human nature, the reason for punishment and the capacity for change, even when someone has committed a truly awful act. And this case also makes us think about the role of mental health in this tragedy.
Absolutely. Even though the court didn't consider Mason's mental state to be a strong enough factor to affect the sentencing, it's essential to acknowledge that mental health can be a significant factor in situations like this. We know adolescence is a period when the brain is still developing, a time when people are more sensitive to stress, trauma, and mental health difficulties.
So while we might never fully understand what led Mason to commit this horrific act, we can't dismiss the possible role that mental health issues might have played. It makes you ask, were there any warning signs that were missed? Were there chances to intervene? And what can we do as a society to better support young people who are struggling?
That's a crucial point. It's not about making excuses for what he did, but trying to understand the complicated factors that might have influenced his behavior. This case is a tragic reminder of how important mental health awareness is, early intervention, and access to resources for young people.
It makes me wonder about the Elkmont community. What kind of support systems did they have for young people before this happened, and how did the community react afterward? Did this event lead to any discussions or initiatives related to mental health awareness?
The community's response was a mix of grief, anger, confusion, and a desperate need for answers. They held vigils and memorials, but there was also this underlying sense of fear and unease. We have to remember that trauma spreads outward, affecting not just those directly involved, but also their families, friends, and the entire community.
So how can communities, especially smaller towns like Elkmont, build resilience and create a more supportive environment for young people? What steps can be taken to address the underlying issues that can lead to violence or feelings of hopelessness?
It begins with promoting open and honest conversations where young people feel safe discussing their struggles without feeling judged or ashamed. That requires education, both for young people and the adults around them. Parents, teachers, coaches, mentors. Everyone needs the knowledge and skills to spot the signs of mental health problems and to respond with compassion and support.
It's about creating a safety net, a feeling of belonging, where young people feel seen, heard, and valued. What can schools do to help create that kind of environment?
Schools are often the first to notice and support students who are having a hard time. They can incorporate mental health education into their curriculum, provide counseling services, train their staff to identify warning signs, and start peer support programs. But this can't fall solely on schools. It takes collaboration with families, community organizations, and mental health professionals.
So it's about creating a network of support that extends beyond the classroom, a network that wraps around young people and their families. This case shows us that we need a multifaceted approach, one that addresses both individual and systemic factors.
Absolutely. We need to look at what's causing the violence and despair among young people. This means tackling issues like poverty, inequality, lack of access to healthcare, and exposure to trauma. These are complex societal problems, but we can overcome them. It demands a collective effort, a willingness to invest in our youth and create communities where their well-being is a priority.
It's about shifting our focus from reacting after a tragedy to actively creating a world where tragedies like this happen less often. It's about nurturing hope, resilience, and the belief that change is possible.
I think that's a powerful message for our listeners. This case has been challenging to explore, filled with sadness, loss, and unresolved questions. But it can also be something that drives positive change, can inspire us to be more aware, more compassionate, and more active in supporting the young people in our lives.
If there's just one thing our listeners take away from this deep dive, what would you want it to be?
I'd want them to remember that every young person deserves to feel safe, loved, and supported. We all have a part to play in making that a reality.
This has been a heavy topic, but a crucial one to discuss. Thank you for helping us navigate this complicated case and sharing your expertise.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's made you think critically, ask questions, and consider the many factors that contribute to tragedies like this one.
Remember, even in the face of darkness, there's always hope. And by working together, we can build a better future for all young people. We've really gone deep on this case, the tragic story of Mason Sisk. It's a case that just brings up all these hard questions about families, the justice system, and mental health. It leaves you thinking about choices and consequences and trying to find meaning in the face of just unimaginable loss.
Yeah, it's one of those cases you don't forget. It forces you to confront some really uncomfortable things about, what people are capable of and how fragile life is. And while we really focused on the specifics of this case, I think we have to remember that it's not an isolated incident. It reflects these bigger societal issues we really need to address.
You're so right. This case is like a smaller version of these larger problems, especially when it comes to, how we care for our young people. We've been talking about the need for awareness around mental health, intervening early, and having resources available. But what are some real, tangible things communities can do to create a better, more supportive environment for their youth?
I think it starts with having a culture where it's okay to talk.
Yeah.
Young people need to feel like they can open up about their struggles, their problems, without being judged or feeling ashamed. That takes education, not just for the kids themselves, but for all the adults around them. I mean, parents, teachers, coaches, mentors, everyone needs the knowledge and tools to recognize if a young person is struggling with their mental health and know how to respond with empathy and support.
It's about having that safety net, a sense of belonging, making sure young people feel seen, heard, and valued. What role do schools play in creating that kind of environment?
Schools are usually the first to see students who might be struggling. They can create mental health programs, offer counseling, train staff to recognize warning signs, and set up peer support groups. But it shouldn't just be on the schools. It takes a real team effort with families, community organizations, and mental health professionals all working together.
It's that network of support extending beyond the classroom, wrapping around young people and their families. This case really underscores the need for that multifaceted approach, addressing both individual needs and the bigger picture systemic factors.
Definitely. We can't ignore those root causes of violence and despair among youth. Addressing things like poverty, inequality, lack of access to health care, and exposure to trauma, that's all part of it. These are big, complicated societal problems, but they're not impossible to solve. It takes all of us working together, being willing to invest in young people and create communities that make their well-being a top priority.
It's that shift, right? Moving away from just reacting to these awful events and focusing on building a world where they're less likely to happen in the first place. It's about fostering hope and resilience and believing that things can get better.
And I think that's a powerful message for everyone listening. This case, it's been a difficult one to explore, full of sadness and loss and so many unanswered questions. But it can also be a springboard for change, for the better. It can inspire us to be more aware, more compassionate, and more active in supporting the young people in our lives.
So if there was one thing you'd want our listeners to take away from this deep dive, what would it be?
Just this. Every young person deserves to feel safe, loved, and supported. And we all have a part to play in creating a world where that's true.
This has been a tough conversation, but so important. Thank you for walking us through this complex case and sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this conversation has challenged you, made you think, and helped you consider all the different things that can contribute to tragedies like this.
And remember, even in the darkest times, there is always hope. And if we work together, we can build a better future for all young people.